Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. On today's episode, we're talking about the Biden administration's bold set of initiatives on immigration. My guest, Ilya Somin, who is a professor of constitutional law at George Mason University, a frequent writer on immigration topics, and a return guest to the podcast, says that the Biden immigration package is the most sweeping package of immigration reforms perhaps that we've ever seen in this country's history, which is a pretty strong statement. And as I always find when I talk to Ilya, I start out with questions based really on just not fully understanding these issues. And by the time we're done talking, I feel so much clearer. So I hope you'll all feel the same way. We have a great conversation on the Biden immigration legislative initiative, what its parts consist of, why they're important, and what their prospects are in this Congress. So stay tuned for this episode of Good Law, Bad Law. I want to welcome back our guest today, Ilya Somin, who's going to be with us on this episode to talk about immigration. Ilya is a professor of law at George Mason University, teaches constitutional law, writes frequently on issues involving immigration, and is the author of the recently published book, Free to Move. So first of all, Ilya, thank you so much for coming back on Good Law, Bad Law.
Thank you very much for having me.
So we have, as you were just describing to me before we got started, an expansive Biden agenda on immigration to talk about. Before we get into the details of it, not that it isn't important, and certainly one of the important issues we face as a country, but I have to say I was a little surprised that apart from COVID relief, this was the first major legislative initiative the brand new Biden administration announced it was going to be rolling out. Did this come as a surprise to you as well?
It didn't come entirely as a surprise, but I was pleasantly surprised at the scope of it. This is the most pro-immigration agenda of any new administration, at the very least in many decades, if not in the entire period when the U.S. has had significant immigration restrictions of over 100 years or more. So it's impressive that he's done this. And while I think most others expected that he would reverse a lot of the egregious anti-immigration actions taken by the previous administration, what Biden has proposed to do goes well beyond that.
Right. I mean, so let's cover that first of all, because those are moves that a president can make with the swipe of a pen, signing an executive order. I know one of them certainly is the policy the Trump administration had on family separation at the border, right? That's done. That's gone, right?
So to a large extent, it was already gone because courts had invalidated it. But what remains will likely be ended by Biden. There certainly will be no more even remnants of the zero tolerance policy, so-called, that led to this. The same thing is true for the travel ban orders targeting Muslim majority nations. Right. Biden eliminated both of them on his very first day in office, and I think there's no doubt that he could do it. If the Trump policies were legal at all, I actually think they were not, but the Supreme Court ruled otherwise. But the Supreme Court ruled otherwise only on the basis that the president had virtually total discretion in this area. So if he has total discretion, then a new president can get rid of it. And similar things can be said, although it will take more time to implement in some cases, for the Remain in Mexico policy. Also for the funding diversion to build the wall. Biden, on his first day in office, canceled the national emergency declared by Trump, which was the authority that Trump claimed enabled him to divert these various military construction funds. There's ongoing litigation about whether Trump really did have the power to do that, but even if he did, that just means Biden could reverse it simply by repealing the emergency declaration, which he did on his first day.
And I think he certainly campaigned regarding that issue on border security, depending a lot more on technology, high technology monitoring of the border rather than a physical wall. So I think we could expect that too as well, right?
Yeah. So he certainly said those things, but it's notable that the bill that he proposes, while it has some high-tech enhancements and the like, there's a very high ratio of pro-immigration policies there relative to so-called border security measures.
Okay, so you're pretty excited about this. Let's kind of move through some of the key provisions, so we know what we're talking about in an overview sense, and then we can talk about what you think is realistic for him actually to accomplish. I mean, we do still have a fairly deadlocked Senate to deal with, and so we can get into some of the political legal aspects of this. But let's start with some of the highlights. He's talking about a path to citizenship for, although we don't know the exact number, most people think it's about 11 million undocumented immigrants living in the United States, and an 8-year path. So can you explain a little bit more particularly what that means?
So as I understand it, the bill would immediately legalize their status in the sense that they would be allowed to live and work in the United States, and also allowed to go back and forth to exit and enter the country. It would take them, I think, several more years to get green card status for legal permanent residency, and then 8 years to be eligible for citizenship. Though to be eligible for citizenship, they would still have to pass the citizenship test, which data show a majority of native-born Americans would fail if they had to take it. So it's an 8-year path to citizenship, but it's an immediate path to legal status and to being able to work in the legal job market as opposed to the black market, and that would both improve the lives of the migrants tremendously, but also benefit the U.S. economy because people can be more productive when they can work legally than when they in effect have to hide in the shadows, as Barack Obama once put it.
Well, and I mean that's a pretty apt description too, and not just metaphorically speaking. I mean, we take for granted and probably can't even begin to imagine the stress families live with when literally they have to hide in the shadows. I mean, President Trump, among the many things that he did, to present what he probably thought was a hard line on immigration, was sending, teams of ICE enforcers out after, groups of individuals, and that's just got to. I mean, it really is living in the hiding in the shadows, and that fear and stress must be enormous.
Yeah, even under Trump, we never came close to deporting more than a small fraction of the undocumented immigrants in the U.S., but the fact that they have to be constantly worried about it and the potential employers had to be worried about it certainly reduced their productivity, increased their stress. Imagine if in a given year you had a 1 in 100 or even say a 1 in 500 or 1 in 1,000 chance of being deported that year and having to live the whole rest of your life in poverty and possibly oppression. That would significantly impact how you live your life, would make it a lot worse. Even if the deportation never actually happened, you would be adjusting your life to make it less likely you'd come to the attention of the authorities, and also potential employers would have to worry about this, and it would be harder to hire you for a lot of potential job opportunities.
Okay, so another aspect of the plan and an aspect of immigration policy generally that I know we've heard so much about in recent years, but I think we still, at least I'm sure I don't have still a clear understanding of, is DACA, which stands for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, DACA. So what, in a nutshell, where have we been with DACA, and what is Biden talking about doing regarding these individuals?
Sure. DACA is a long and complicated story. but basically it has its origins in efforts that date back quite a few years to legalize the status of a large category of people who were brought to the U.S. illegally at a time when they themselves were minors, I believe under 18, and they were brought across the border by their parents. In many cases, they have lived in the U.S. nearly their entire lives, often not even speaking the language of the country they came from, and so on. And Congress made various efforts to legalize the status of these people who, depending on how you calculate, may number at least 700,000 or 800,000, but possibly more than that, depending on how you draw the line. When Congress failed to pass the DREAM Act, which would have been the bill that legalized them, Barack Obama in 2012 issued what is in effect an executive policy, not legalizing them as such, but in effect saying they won't be deported, and giving them the right to have jobs and the like. Then when Trump came to power, he tried to terminate DACA, and extensive litigation followed. Last year, the Supreme Court ruled in a close 5-4 decision that Trump's efforts to terminate DACA were illegal, but not because he had no authority to do it, but rather because in the process of doing it, he violated various provisions of the Administrative Procedure Act, i.e., the court left open the possibility that if Trump or now some future administration tried to get rid of DACA, but did the bureaucratic niceties the right way and dotted their I's and crossed their T's and so on, that they would be able to do it. The new administration has first issued a new set of orders reinstating DACA and canceling various new administrative efforts that Trump had undertaken since the Supreme Court decision to try to undermine DACA further. In addition, full legalization of the status of all of the DACA recipients is part of the bill that Biden is submitting to Congress. And I think legalization by Congress, is the best long-term fix for this issue, because even if Biden manages to reinstate the executive policy first done by President Obama, and even if that reinstatement survives new legal challenges, which will almost certainly be filed, and some of them are already underway by red states and other groups, still that policy, like most other purely executive policies, would be vulnerable to enactment or erosion by a future president, whereas a legalization adopted by Congress would be much, much less vulnerable.
And how many people are we talking about who would fall under the auspices of DACA?
That's a great question. As of the time of the Supreme Court ruling, there were probably something like 700,000 people who fell under it. However, that is who had applied for DACA status and were listed as having it by the federal government. However, there are more people who could apply, and potentially could be expanded to cover some of the parents and other close relatives of the kids themselves. So in the most expansive version of it, it could be as much as a couple million or so. But in the most narrow version, just taking in those who were already listed as DACA participants, I believe it's in the range of 700,000 or so.
Okay. And when you say moving to legalize the status of those individuals, would that be a similar 8-year pathway? It's first legalized so you're not living here illegally, put you on a path to getting a green card, and then ultimately into position where you can apply for citizenship?
I would have to check whether there's a different provision in the Biden bill for them that might enable them to get citizenship faster. I just don't remember offhand if that is the case.
Okay.
But it would at the very least legalize their presence in the U.S., make them permanently eligible for employment, and that would no longer depend on the whim of whoever happens to be in the White House. And over time, they would be able to get green cards and resident and citizenship at the very least. I just don't remember exactly what time frame Biden's bill provides for that.
Right. And then, of course, once they have citizenship, with that would come the right to vote, which is very important.
Yes.
political aspect to this whole effort?
Potentially, but I would say two things. One is, for most of these people, the right to vote and citizenship would not come for 8 years. And we also know that recent immigrants tend to vote at lower rates than longer-term residents or native-born citizens. So while these people could have a political effect in the long run, and for some Republicans that's an additional reason to oppose this, I actually think that effect is greatly overstated because it would take them a long time to be citizens, and even after they do become citizens, their voting rates are not likely to be high. I would add that when you look at other measures of political participation, like volunteering, campaign finance, donations, and so on, there's an even larger gap between recent immigrants and native-born citizens when it comes to voting. So you can say that's a bad thing if you think immigrants change politics for the better, but if you think they change it for the worse, then you should find that reassuring.
The politics part of this always feels so dirty, no matter how you look at it. But okay.
Yeah. No, I agree that it's dirty. I was just trying to state some facts about how it works.
No, I know. I know you're being fair and looking at it from both perspectives. But it just seems more craven, and we should be thinking about this in terms of what's the right thing to do here for these people. But all right. So what else is there then in the Biden legislative proposal that we should be paying attention to,
Ilya? So there are provisions allowing some people who had been deported under Trump but had previously lived for the U.S. for 3 years or more to return to reunite with their families. It raises annual per-country limits on family-based immigration, the family reunification immigration, and also it eliminates those limits entirely for people who are here on employment visas. Also, there's an exemption for spouses and children of green card holders from employment-based immigration quotas. That is, if your husband or wife or your child has a green card, then your relatives can come in under employment-based visas without a quota. And there's a number of other efforts to make it easier to get in, such as work permits for holders of H-1B visas. These are mostly workers who, in various high-tech and other technology industries, one big barrier to recruiting more of them in recent years is that it's been very difficult for their spouses and children to get work permits in the U.S. And as in the U.S., so too in the countries where many of these workers come from, like China and India. Just as many highly educated workers in the U.S., their spouses also work. The same is true for these people. So all of this collectively would allow many thousands of additional people to come in a given year, and many of them would be very valuable contributors to U.S. economy, such as with the relatives of H-1B visa holders. It would also mean we get more H-1B visa holders themselves, and they are extremely valuable contributors to the high-tech industry, among other industries.
Well, and you've made this connection between immigration, more open immigration policy, and positive impact on the economy a few times already in our conversation. I know that's something that we talked about at length the last time you were on the program. Is that, how much of that do you think is driving the Biden administration in pushing this as one of the first big legislative initiatives it's coming out with?
So I don't know whether that's a big part of their motivation or not, but I think the effects of the policies in this area matter much more than the motives do. So even if Biden personally doesn't care that much about the economic effects, what's important is that those effects do exist. It would make both undocumented immigrants who are currently here plus new immigrants much more productive than they were before. In addition, enabling easier access for work visas and H-1Bs and the like is extremely valuable to American technological innovation and to the overall growth of the economy. I've mentioned in some of my other writings that many of the people who have enabled the technological advances that have helped us during the COVID crisis, including producing the COVID vaccines, are in fact immigrants. If we allowed more people in, we would have more of that impact. We would have more vaccines and treatments for more different kinds of diseases, more technological productivity, and more benefits of other kinds, both for the immigrants themselves, obviously, but also for natives.
Right. I mean, these people who are trying to leave whatever country they're coming from, if they're if we have an overly restrictive immigration policy in this country, they're probably going to go somewhere else. They're not necessarily going to stay in their country. They're going to look for a country that is accommodating and that has economic opportunities that they may not have in their home country. So we are really hurting ourselves in having an overly restrictive immigration policy. We think of it, the slogans are all America first and protect America, but it actually ends up, following your logic, having an anti-American effect.
Yeah, so in some cases, some of these people might go to places like Canada, which for the moment at least has more open policies than we do. But I would say actually it's even worse if they remain trapped in their home countries, where in most cases they can't be nearly as productive. Then the entire world is deprived of the benefit of their potential achievements, innovations, and so on. So, for example, many of the people behind the first two COVID-19 vaccines that were approved in December, they were immigrants from very poor nations like, I believe, Algeria, Lebanon, and elsewhere. Had they been forced to remain in those places, they probably would not have been able to make those scientific contributions at all. So they wouldn't have. The issue is not just that those contributions might have been made in Canada versus the U.S. or something like that. It's that the world wouldn't have the benefit of them at all. So Other things equal, I'm more concerned about the person who's forced to stay in some place where they can't actually be productive and successful versus the person who ends up going to Canada as opposed to the U.S., though to the people who care about sort of the competitiveness of the U.S. as compared to other advanced nations, that second effect is also significant. I should modify my point, actually. The person from Algeria was not one of the developers of vaccine. He was actually the head of the Operation Warp Speed overall program under the Trump administration, and he was originally from Algeria. Monsef Slaoui, I believe is his name.
Right. Okay, so now let me bring in another aspect of the overall immigration policy tangle that perhaps forces us to look in a different direction on some of these things, because of course one of the very short form and very misleading political slogans we heard in the last election is, Democrats and those more, quote, liberal on immigration are for, quote, open borders. And we saw this play out in 2018 with these migrant caravans coming north from Central America. My understanding is that Democrats generally, and Biden in particular, was emphasizing, diplomatic efforts and economic measures to try to keep some of those people at home in their countries, and that is an aspect of this new Biden initiative. So can you address all of that together? Because it is really misleading to say that someone like Joe Biden is for open borders.
So I myself am in fact for open borders, and Biden is not me or anywhere close to me. When I say I'm for open borders, what I mean is that there should be a presumption of freedom of movement, where people are allowed to live where they want, unless there's some clear evidence that the person poses some sort of threat, like they're a terrorist or they're spreading a deadly disease or something like that. But that's not Biden's policy or the policy of almost anybody in the Democratic Party. What the Biden and the Democrats propose to do is to make entry into the U.S. incrementally easier. So there would be more options for legal immigration. And they also propose to cut back in various ways on deportation of undocumented immigrants who are already here. So you can say it's a step in the direction of open borders, but pretty much any liberalization of immigration policy of any kind could be described in that way. It is also true, as you note, that in the Biden's bill, there are some policies to try to improve conditions in Central American nations such that the hope is fewer people would move here. They intend to provide something like $4 billion of new economic assistance to these countries. I'm actually not enthusiastic about this particular aspect of the plan. Lots of evidence shows that sending more economic aid to dysfunctional governments does little to improve the quality of those governments. To my mind, we shouldn't be afraid of those people coming here. Instead, the lives of migrants will be better, and their productivity will benefit the U.S. economy. And research shows that one of the things that does help improve governance in dysfunctional nations is actually if they have a diaspora of people who live in freer and more successful societies. That improves things in those origin countries in two ways. One is it creates an interchange of ideas by communicating with their relatives back home. They can show them in various ways that there are better options for governance than the ones that currently exist in their countries. And second, many of the people send remittances back to their relatives back in the home country, which makes them economically better off and also less dependent on the government for various forms of assistance. And both of those effects also help to stimulate moves for liberalization and improvements in the quality of government. So if I were Biden, not that he would listen to me, but if I were him, I would cut out the economic aid proposal, but instead just let more people in and put pressure on those governments to improve in that way. Another form of pressure is that those governments, if talented people leave, the governments would have more incentives to improve the quality of their policies in order to try to retain them.
Okay. Okay. Well, and then a couple of other parts of immigration, broadly speaking, that get a lot less attention, but I know are issues that you've been particularly concerned about are legal immigration, because so much of the focus is on illegal immigration, but there is legal immigration, and there are some proposed changes in that regard. You may have already touched on that by talking about increasing the limits on the numbers of people who can come in from certain countries. But the issue of legal immigration and also the issue of asylum, which is a form of legal immigration to the country.
Yes.
What is Biden talking about in those areas?
So one of the biggest impacts, actually the biggest impact of the Trump policies was not on illegal immigration, but actually on legal, which he cut down to lower levels proportionally than have ever existed in all of American history. And he did that through a wide range of different kinds of measures, such as cutting the annual refugee cap almost to zero, and also setting up all sorts of bureaucratic obstacles towards gaining legal immigrant status, even down to rejecting people if they didn't put down a middle name on a form, even if they themselves didn't have a middle name. If they didn't put like an X or something through the line where you would put down a middle name, people would get rejected for things like that. So I think the Biden administration intends to unwind a lot of this bureaucratic BS that was done. They also intend to raise the refugee limit from the current, I think, 18,000 to, I believe, 125,000, which should be more than existed even under the Obama years. They plan various other efforts to make legal immigration easier, such as increasing the number of immigration judges so there wouldn't be as much of a backlog, and also clearing the backlog of various kinds of visa applications and the like. A lot of this stuff is sort of in the weeds, but when you put it all together, it can make a big difference.
All right, so let's talk politics a little bit then on all of this, because clearly Congress passing a new law is going to have more staying power, pun intended, than an executive order type action. But the Democrats didn't pick up as many seats as some were hoping for, so that they'd have firm control in the Senate. They lost some seats in the House. they're in control, but they're just not, firmly in control, at least for the time being. It doesn't do any good to come out with all these great initiatives if they end up, dead on arrival in Congress. Do you have any sense for which parts of this package of initiatives is most likely to get through and become law?
So I don't know the politics of all of them. I think it's unlikely that Congress will just enact the whole thing. However, the very fact that Biden is sending it over and is making it one of his major initiatives, even if a lot of it doesn't get passed in the near future, it moves what scholars call the Overton window on these matters. That is, it expands the range of what people see as part of mainstream political discussion. So even if it doesn't all pass immediately, it's still a step in the right direction. Second, there are obviously some parts of it which are more popular than others. The single most popular would be legalizing the DACA recipients, which enjoys something like 70% or more public support. It may now be possible to pass what is known as sort of a clean DACA bill. That is a bill legalizing the status of these people without any significant concessions on other immigration issues to restrictionists. With Trump gone, that may be feasible. And there might be other provisions as well that can pass individually, like those related to H-1B visas and others, which are supported by Democrats, but also some Republicans with ties to business interests that would benefit. And obviously, there are some policies that are executive actions which would have a big impact even if at some point in the future they do get reversed. For instance, increasing the annual refugee cap. Even if in a future year it gets lowered, the people let in the years when the higher cap was operative, they still get to stay here. So for every year that stays in place, that's 100,000 or more people who are able to live much happier and freer lives, or sometimes are saved from death and oppression as a result. And the same goes for other ways to make things easier for asylum seekers. Those granted asylum, in most cases, it's impossible to reverse, or at least extremely difficult to reverse after they get it.
Well, and it also seems to me you have to, as we're seeing in a very different context with this impeachment, people are going to have to go on record. They're going to have to put their name down, yay or nay. And although we've just come through a presidential election, we're kind of always in a congressional election cycle. So,
sure.
To put it out there in such a bold way and to raise hopes that something can get done, I think has to put a tremendous political pressure, maybe not on the most hardline folks in Congress who can afford to be so because of the way their districts are drawn, but for anybody, closer to the middle or on the edge, I think it's got to put a tremendous pressure. So at least there's going to be a big conversation about this.
Yeah, it might be. I mean, obviously, if it fails spectacularly and it's perceived as a huge political loss for Biden, then it could have a counterproductive effect. But if what happens is, not all of it passes, but some parts do, and it doesn't seem like Biden has taken political damage from it, then it will move the conversation, even if the ideas don't get enacted immediately. And there's, over the last few years, there have been a number of examples of policies that were previously seen as radical out of the mainstream that are now in the mainstream, even if, they haven't actually been enacted. Obviously, that's true of some of the more ridiculous restrictionist positions advocated by Trump. It's true of things like Medicare for All, which I'm not a fan of and which is unlikely to be enacted in the near future, but it's clearly part of the political conversation in a way that it wasn't 5 or 6 years ago. And there's a list of other similar examples. So the large-scale, massive legalization of undocumented immigrants that's in this bill, I'm not optimistic that it can pass in its full form, but the very fact that the president has proposed it is a way to move the conversation. It's now a mainstream idea. You may or may not like that it's a mainstream idea, but it's a mainstream idea in a way that it was not only under Trump, but even under Obama, who never proposed anything remotely like this.
Wow, incredible. Well, it's an exciting time for those like you who care so much about this issue, and we all should. And Ilya, I just have to thank you. When we talk, I feel like everything has become so much clearer in my mind. So I hope listeners will feel the same way, and really appreciate you taking time to speak with me today. And thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.